Good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar on 3 months to go, Brexit and UK trade. My colleague Grace is just going to put up some slides for me. Thank you very much, Grace. I'm Henrietta Brealey. I'm the Director of Policy and Strategic Relationships at the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce, and I'm joined here today by our guest expert, David Thorneloe. Good morning, David.
Morning, Henrietta, and morning, everyone.
So David is Legal Director at Pinsent Masons, and he has pretty unparalleled experience in working at senior levels with UK government and advising businesses on a wide range of issues around understanding and engaging with government legislation. It's pretty topical today. He's currently advising the UK government on developing its new internal market legislation, which, as we know, is pretty high profile at the moment. So hopefully, if anyone knows what's going on, it's going to be this guy. Before I hand over to David, I do have a few updates for you from the GBCC. So next slide, please, Grace. Thank you very much. During today's session, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the webinar chat. We're coming to an audience Q&A after David's presentation. And my colleague Grace, who is currently manning the chat, is on hand to answer any technical queries as well. So next slide, please. As many of you will know, the Chamber is a not-for-profit business membership and business support organisation that exists to connect, support and grow local businesses. For the past 6 months, we've been actively helping keep business moving through our COVID supported engagement programmes. You can see more details on your screen now. But of course, we are also working with our fellow regional chambers and the West Midlands Combined Authority to scale up Brexit support for businesses. Next slide, please. This includes free digital workshops, free training courses and international trade, things like customs declarations, import and export procedures, and those training courses are usually worth £220 plus VAT per delegate, so really worth getting involved in if you trade internationally. We're also running a customs consultancy helpline and putting together plenty of free digital resources, briefing papers, videos and checklists on key end of Brexit transition topics. Within the Chamber, we have a significant international hub with combined centuries of experience across our members of staff in export and import documentation, customs processes and procedures, and accessing new markets. This supports, and in particular the customs helpline I just mentioned, opens up access to that knowledge to the business community. So if you have any questions, please do get in touch. Next slide, please. Coming up, we have a range of really interesting sessions. So in just a couple of weeks' time, we've got a session on people and HR. You've probably spotted there's a whole new immigration system coming in, as well as the EU settlement scheme. And this is going to be a really valuable session for HR managers, directors, businesses to understand the implications for businesses of the end of Brexit transition on people and skills. We've got a session on the services sector. It's often the trading goods that dominates the headlines when it comes to end of Brexit transition, but there are also a number of questions for the services sector as well. So we're running a dedicated session on that. And then, of course, data protection. We've actually got one of David's colleagues who will be leading a session for us on that on the 15th of October, really looking into transfers of data, what the implications are for the end of Brexit transition period on those. In terms of training courses, we've got some great sessions on import procedures, export documentation, customs procedures and documentation coming up over the next few weeks too. And as mentioned, if you do have any queries, please do reach out. The number for our customs support helpline is up on the screen there. Now, that's more than enough for me, but before I hand back over to our guest speaker, David, I wanted to leave you with a fun fact about the Chamber. So we were founded back in 1813, and we were founded because the tradespeople of Birmingham were struggling to access European markets in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars and wanted to do something collective about it. So while, of course, the context is pretty different today, it does seem strangely fitting that we're still supporting businesses on ongoing access to European markets through the current changes and the changes to come. And we're going to be here to help whatever happens, short term, long term. So if you ever do need any support or have any further questions, please do reach out. Now, back on to today's topic, Brexit and UK trade. So David, obviously the UK internal market bill, been pretty topical recently. There's a big deadline looming when it comes to EU-UK trade deal. And there's been news on trade deals in recent weeks with countries like Japan. So I think it's safe to say that in the weeks after we booked this session in, it's all got pretty topical, hasn't it?
Yes, I think it was always inevitable that things were going to be hotting up this autumn, and that 2020 was going to be a big year. And obviously we never knew it was going to be in the context of obviously the COVID crisis, which is really dominating so much of our thoughts. But unfortunately, Brexit is not going away.
Absolutely, and in fact coming pretty quickly down the line. So over to you, David. What actually is going on, and what does it all mean for businesses?
Okay, yes. Well, let me see if I can share my screen. I've got a few slides, so I'll keep it just fairly high level. And what I was planning to cover was really to give you an update around the new trade picture that's emerging that we can expect to see in January. So I'll give you sort of 5 or 10 minutes on that, and then I'll move on to the position on Brexit and the UK-EU negotiations. So I'll keep it fairly high level, but very happy to come back to things in more detail if anyone has questions. So why do free trade agreements matter? If we go back to basics, it's because we in the UK and most countries around the world and the EU are members of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And what the WTO agreements provide for are default terms on trade between those nations. Most important of those for these purposes is the most favoured nation principle. Now, what that means is that if as a nation we decide to apply our most favourable tariff and quota regime to our favourite trading partner, we have to apply the same ones to all our trading partners. So it's a sense of equality. There are a few exceptions to that, and the most important one for practical purposes is if you have a free trade agreement with your trading partner that covers substantially all the trade between them. And of course, for the last 50 years, we have been party to the EU, which is one ginormous free trade agreement, and which is why we've had tariff-free trade, which we've benefited from within the EU. What does that look like then for trade currently? Well, pre-Brexit, and this is the position that continues up until the end of this year because we're still in the Brexit transition period. This is what UK trade barriers or lack of trade barriers has looked like with the rest of the world. You'll see in blue there on the right, nearly half of our trade is with EU nations, and that is all tariff-free and free from quotas under EU law. You then see there's another 11% down at the bottom there. Those are countries that the the EU has concluded free trade agreements with over the years, and where either there are reduced barriers or perhaps no barriers at all to trade on certain products. And then you have the 40%, which are the rest of the world. Probably the biggest single chunk of that rest of the world is the USA, which counts for about 15% of the UK's trade in that bucket there. So that's how the position looks currently until the end of the year. The picture that's emerging for January looks quite different. So here we are now. What does that look like for barriers to UK trade with the rest of the world from January? Well, what we have is just 10% of our trade is, at the moment, is looking like it will be covered by free trade agreements that the UK has in place with other trading partners. Those are around 20 agreements, chiefly EU agreements, where the UK has approached those other nations and rolled over those agreements to apply on broadly the same terms to the UK. The biggest and most significant of those was the recently announced UK-Japan deal, but even that just accounted for 2%, so it boosted that number from 8% up to 10% of UK trade being covered by trade deals. You see the rest of that 90%, obviously that includes the EU, accounting again for half our trade, looking at the moment like it's not covered by a trade deal. So it looks rather different. What can we expect that to mean? Well, you see that's quite a starkly different picture to the one we've really become accustomed to over the last 10, 20 more years. So we can expect to see a lot more tariffs. That can vary by industry. If you look at the car industry, typically there are tariffs around 3 to 6% on imported car parts, and certainly we've seen lots in the news about the UK car industry lobbying the government about how that's really going to pose a real challenge to the margins of the UK car industry. And just in the news again this morning was the retail industry, I think it was, making the point that tariffs on food coming in from the EU would be in the region of 20% on average. So that would really hit each of us over the course of a year, just in terms of our weekly supermarket shops. We can expect to see that a real impact on costs. Now, before I move on to Brexit, the other angle, in which Henrietta mentioned earlier, is the UK internal market. Oops. Now, interestingly, the UK government not quite so keen on the EU's internal market, but is keen to preserve the UK's internal market and stop new barriers to trade coming up within our islands. The concern there is that what might happen after Brexit takes real effect at the end of the year is that the Scottish government or the Welsh government might impose higher regulatory standards when they're no longer subject to the constraints of EU law, and that this might start to create new barriers to trade within the UK. And that in turn could have an impact internationally, make the UK less attractive for trade if other nations, businesses from around the world are importing in and they're not sure if they're having to account for different regulatory regimes within the UK. So what this UK internal market bill essentially does is, if there is that new divergence in regulation that starts to emerge, that it will be unenforceable. So if, for example, the Welsh government decided to ban the use of a particular plastic in food packaging, then if that packaging remained completely lawful in England, then products that are produced in England, imported and sold lawfully in England could still be sold in Wales, and that new Welsh requirement could not be enforced in relation to any of those producers. I wasn't planning to go into all the ins and outs of the bill, but I'm certainly very happy to return to it. It's been a fun feature of my life for the last couple of months, working with the UK government and being a lively episode. I'm very happy to talk about that. And also, if you want to know more, then look out, we're putting for a webinar that we in Pinsent Masons are putting on in October to try and explain to businesses what the bill is all about and what it offers to them. Turning to Brexit then, I see a nice picture of Monsieur Barnier and Mr. Frost. The talks have been going since about the spring, so for about 6 months now. I think 6 months was always going to be an extremely ambitious timetable. These are negotiations on trade that will normally take years to complete. We've heard regular reports there has been progress around the edges on some of the less controversial issues around transport, energy, cooperation, that kind of thing. But it has also been abundantly clear that there is deadlock on the real key issues around UK access to the EU's single market and tariff-free trade, and the EU's demands in return. It has demanded the so-called level playing field guarantees to stop the UK being able to take advantage of having access to the EU market, but at the same time being able to undercut EU competition, whether that's through subsidies or lighter regulation. So that's why the EU has been pushing for those level playing field guarantees. The other thing we know, there is a deadline for a deal for the end of October. This isn't like the deadlines we've seen over the last few years where people say, oh, this is happening, oh, another extension, another extension. This really does look like a real deadline. It's clear that the transition period is ending at the end of the year. Both sides are agreed on that. Legally, there does not seem to be a way to do it. So I think probably with all things, when I'm going to start gazing into my crystal ball, I will never say never, but it really does look highly improbable there could be any extension beyond the end of this year. And that in turn means the deadline for a deal is the end of October. Everyone is agreed on that. And I said that because there needs to be that time for the deal to be ratified in the EU and the UK, being put into law, and also being implemented practically and operationally. It's quite a major change and complex thing. And indeed, in any normal sane world, two months would be an incredibly tight timescale to do that. So I think this time round we are looking at real deadlines, and so we can expect to get that certainty by end of October. How have the negotiations been playing out? Well, we know, if you may recall, that Theresa May famously did not take Donald Trump's advice on how to play the EU negotiations, and had to stand there next to him while he told the world's press this as well. Things look quite differently now with the Boris Johnson government, and I think it's fair to say that the tough talking approach which we have seen to these negotiations has come straight out of the Donald Trump playbook as well. We've seen a lot of really playing it tough, looking the EU straight in the eye and making it clear that the UK is not going to budge its position. Some quite public carping and criticism of the EU, some playing to the gallery, playing to the government's own supporters. And then really to top it all, as we've seen in the last few weeks, the UK Internal Market Bill, what's been described as putting a loaded gun on the table in the negotiations, threatening to breach last year's withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, which the UK considers to be unfair and unreasonable in a number of ways. And of course, from the EU's perspective, that is crucial, highly sensitive politically, the protocol being designed to avoid a hard border returning to the island of Ireland. So a really important issue for both the UK and the EU. I think what that has meant is the talks are hanging by a thread, and for me, I don't. Sadly, my job to be the prophet of doom this morning, and I will try not to be too doomy, but I think a deal is looking highly unlikely now. Is Boris bluffing? We're seeing a lot of discussion in the press. Well, might he do another last-minute U-turn? I think for me, we need to remember, let's look back 12 months ago. Last September, this government was new, bedding in under Boris Johnson. And this government was very prepared and very happy to take the UK into a no-deal Brexit last October. And it was only stopped by Conservative rebels joining Labour to stop that happening. And what that really shows, and what we've continued to hear, and what I've continued to hear, and that's both publicly and the messages privately within government are exactly the same as those that we hear publicly from the government, is that the government is very comfortable politically with this no-deal outcome. What we hear time and time again in the press is this very populist narrative that what Brexit is about, it's about regaining UK sovereignty, regaining that control and independence. And I think this government is very comfortable politically with selling that narrative. And if no deal is the outcome as the cost for that, then I think this government is prepared to live with that. I think the other thing that people ask about, and that U-turn last year, well, you know, the extension was forced, Boris did make the U-turn. I think this situation practically is quite different to what it was then. What happened then, there was a clear political advantage to the government of getting that deal done and then presenting it for the general election. And also in practical terms, the deal was nearly done. There were hundreds of pages that had already been nailed down. There was just the issue around the Northern Ireland Protocol attached to the end. And what's more, the offer that Boris took, it had been on the table from the EU for the best part of a year already. You may remember Theresa May had declined it, and even Boris Johnson himself had said no UK Prime Minister could ever accept a protocol that drew a border down the Irish Sea. So that offer had been around. There was a quick negotiation over 4 to 6 weeks. That sort of revised Northern Ireland Protocol was knocked up and slapped onto the agreement, and the deal was done last November. What's different this time is what we're hearing is the parties haven't even moved on. There is no deal on the table. We've heard lots of talk about good progress being made on issues. And those are political agreements in principle, which are great as far as they go. But one can't estimate the challenge of turning that into a full negotiation into hundreds of pages of legal text on a free trade agreement. It's not just sending the lawyers off into a room on a Friday afternoon. That's usually the hard part of the negotiation, really ironing out those points of principle. So the parties haven't even moved on to that. So for me, the notion that even if there were quite a swift U-turn, that deal could be done in the next 4 weeks, it just feels highly unlikely. And certainly within the civil service and my contacts that I'm talking to there is a sense of pessimism. So I think what we're seeing, best case, there might be a thin deal that could be pulled out of the fire that might just mitigate some of the worst edges, the worst bumps of a no deal exit. But more likely for me is I don't expect to see a deal. That probably both sides will agree to suspend the negotiations from the end of October and to start focusing on preparing for no deal with a view to resuming those negotiations at the end of the year. And for me, what I see playing out in the news is both parties, I think, are playing the blame game. It's about not being seen to be the first one to walk away from those discussions. I think both sides are playing that quite carefully, and I think we will continue to see that play out probably right up to mid to late October. So let's try and be constructive, be positive. What if we're preparing for no deal? It's coming in January. Then what can we do? Oops, let me get my notes there. This is not really what we want to hear right now. To say there is a storm coming, what we know is we're already dealing with the fact that our houses are on fire already and have been since the spring when we've been dealing with COVID. But there is a storm coming. It's time to dust off those no-deal preparations that were being worked up back in 2018, and think about how to prepare our businesses for quite major changes in the UK's international trade that are coming in January. So it's really about going back to those basic things, reviewing where our businesses interact with the EU or where our supply chains interact with the EU or other nations around the world. Factoring in not only those cost questions about tariffs on goods and imports, but also are there other regulatory barriers which may start to come up and affect our trade? Is there going to be disrupt? I think we can. Well, is there going to be? I think we can expect to see the government is now being quite open about the likelihood of disruption from new border checks. The brave new world of erecting a new border at Dover in January. So how might that have an impact on supply chains as well? In practical terms, working out how does that work for you and your business? Well, as Henrietta was saying at the beginning, there's some great materials on Birmingham Chambers of Commerce website there. So there's a link there on the Brexit materials. Also on our Pinsent Masons website, we've got loads of advice there on targeted at particular sectors and areas to focus on and the advice on issues to prepare for. If you're thinking about these issues about, well, how do I find out, how will I know if where these free trade agreements are in place, how will I know what tariffs I need to start factoring into my business planning? There is some really good stuff on the government's gov.uk website. So the first link there's a list of all of the UK trade agreements that it does have in place with non-EU countries, so you can check if you're trading with a particular country there that you want to check. And also the UK has published its global tariff. You may remember I said at the beginning, those WTA terms, it needs to be broadly one tariff for everyone that the UK applies unless it has free trade agreements. And you can check that tariff on gov.co website. You just do a nice little search for the particular good or product that you have in mind, you think of importing into the UK, and can get the details. And the EU there at the bottom has a similar website and checker to check the EU. So that's if you're going to be importing goods into the EU, then you can find out what the tariffs are the EU would be proposing. It's not going to be all doom and gloom. Let's look back to what we saw 18 months ago. I think as we were preparing for a possible no-deal Brexit back in March 2019, I think we can expect to see similar things then. And so come November, December, if as I expect, a deal has been ruled out and we move to that no-deal focus, I think we'll expect to see these unilateral short-term mitigations and exemptions that both the EU for their part and the UK will adopt, just to try and soften those bumps in the road and that disruption that would come in January from a no deal. And looking back 18 months ago, that can give us a really good idea of what's coming. I think if both sides were prepared to put those measures in place back then, there is every chance we can expect to see the similar measures again. The UK government has already indicated, for example, that the border checks the UK imposes are going to be pretty light touch for the first 6 months. And I think probably just for the practical reason that the UK has not been able to get everything it needs in place to be able to do that. I think if there is a silver lining, it certainly is a tough time for businesses, and probably, as I said, the last thing you need to be told is the storm is coming when the house is already on fire. But I think if there is a silver lining, it's that we're already looking very hard at how do we review the ways we do business, and COVID has forced that upon us. And how do we look at our business plans? Do we need to find new ways of working? And I think that silver lining with Brexit is that we're doing that work already. Brexit doesn't need to be an entirely new work stream starting again from scratch. I think it's a case of that work that we're doing in adapting to the COVID world. It's just that these post-Brexit realities need to be factored into that planning. That would be my advice.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, David. A sobering reality there, with the likelihood of there being a potential no-deal Brexit, and the importance of planning already in the midst of the coronavirus crisis. And also lots of different aspects to your presentation. If I may, I'm going to pick up on a few of those, and audience, please do feel free to pop your questions in the chat as well. So first up, that 10% of UK trade that there are trade deals lined up for following Brexit. Within there, are there any, aside from Japan, that stand out to you as actually this is quite an important one to be aware of, pretty positive one? And on the flip side, are there any that haven't been transferred over from existing EU trade deals, which could be problematic for businesses if there are any significant markets there?
Yeah, so well, certainly Japan is the standout from those 20 or so deals that the UK has managed to get in place. The other one that is of a similar scale is the Switzerland one, and that also counts for about another 2% there as a major trading partner. So the other 20 are just factored into that remaining 6% of the UK's trade. So very small, not to be discounted, and certainly there may be some businesses that are doing all their trade, but they're quite small trade partners there, the likes of Israel, some Central American countries, some Central African countries, smaller nations like Kosovo and places like that. So some of them really are quite small, although maybe particular niche businesses may have those partners. I mean, when you look statistically at where are the UK's biggest trading partners, apart from that half of that trade going to the EU, the other significant ones are the USA, which counts for about 15% of our trade. And of course, both the UK and indeed over the years, the EU has tried to conclude a deal with the US that is fraught with difficulties, and that's political, really, because concluding a free trade deal, it's political, it's economic, and it involves compromise and being prepared to sort of give up some of that protection for one's own industries in order to get something else. And we've certainly, the US traditionally been quite reluctant to engage in that kind of compromise. So that doesn't bode too well. So that would really, the US would be one of the biggies. China, again, very difficult to do a trade deal with China. That doesn't look realistic. The UK isn't trying. That accounts for 5% of UK trade. There's nothing else. There's no other country that accounts for more than 3% of the UK's trade. Probably, just to go back to your question about which of those countries where the EU has got trade agreements in place and where we won't have, I would probably say it's places, it's Singapore, Korea, Canada. Those are probably the biggest ones where we will be losing the benefit of those free trade agreements, and where the UK does not yet have those agreements rolled over. I think those are ones that the UK will have the ambition over the next year or two to try and get those agreements in place. But those are probably, if I was going to single out three, it would be those three are the ones that are missing at the moment.
What do you reckon the likelihood is that there will be any further trade deals concluded before we get into this 31st of December deadline?
Putting aside the EU, which I've mentioned, I think just practically looking very unlikely for the others now. I think ministers have been trying to talk up the prospects of a quick deal. We know that negotiations have started with Australia, New Zealand, and the USA. But I mentioned earlier, these negotiations, then they will normally take years. The notion they could kind of be knocked off in 6 weeks is just highly ambitious. The US one especially will be really fraught, some really difficult issues, and with the election coming up, bringing that deadline further forward as well for a deal. So it seems that they're not really talking up the prospect of any of those three negotiations being concluded this year, and I really would be surprised. Certainly Australia and New Zealand are good prospects for 2021, and the US one, that could be difficult. That certainly depends in part on the outcome of the US election, but I think realistically I would still expect that to be a year or two's of quite tough negotiation, even if it was a different administration in the US.
So within that then, looking ahead to obviously trade deal with the EU, potentially not, potentially quite likely not, or only a thin trade deal if it does indeed come through. Obviously trade deals aren't essential for trade. I mean, you mentioned US and China are already significant UK markets without trade deals in place. But thinking in particular about EU, if a deal isn't agreed at a very high level, because I appreciate the question I'm about to ask you could be multiple webinars in and of itself, but what are the main implications for businesses, do you think? If the EU-UK trade deal cannot be agreed, what are those top pieces that you're looking at?
I think the thing about the UK-EU relationship, probably the first thing that we will all notice, which is deal or no deal, is just the disruption of a border being erected between the UK and the EU. So that's deal or no deal. We're going to see that from January. That's absolutely clear. So that's the first point I'd probably say. The second, I think, is just the cost factor. The cost factor when we're talking about imports, and perhaps also if we're talking about quotas as well, could restrict things. I think the other changes that we will see, they're probably not going to be immediate, but longer term as we sort of drift a bit further away from the EU and from being used to being a part of their regulatory landscape. And what we will see, I think, over a period, some nations may be quicker than others, is they will have that freedom to put up more regulatory barriers to UK businesses operating in their countries, so the services sectors as well in particular. Those things probably won't change so much overnight on the 1st of January, but depending on the outlooks of particular governments within the EU, they will have that opportunity to go back to more protectionist measures, those measures which EU law prevents them putting in place in regard to other EU member states, so we won't get that same protection. I mean, I think long term there is every sense for optimism. I think either that this UK government could do a deal of some kind with the EU, given a bit more time over the course of next year. But perhaps a more likely scenario is that it would be a different government, whether that would be a different Conservative government with, you know, leaning in a slightly different direction, or looking further ahead to a Labour, to a general election, if we would see a Labour government coming in 3 or 4 years' time, that they might pick up the baton and sort of campaign on the basis of a new deal with the EU. So I think we will certainly see some bumpiness, some real bumpiness those opening months of 2021. I think we'll kind of get used to a new normal, those extra costs and ways of working that we are factoring in, and I think we'll also then start to see longer term that new narrative of trying to sort of rebuild that relationship in new ways with the EU.
So very much 31st of December isn't the end of the conversation. There's still plenty of negotiations, future deals and all sorts to be done. But important points for the audience there, particularly around the areas where there may or may not be ongoing deals with nations that the EU has trade deals with. Obviously, a lot of the press is around check your trade with the EU, make sure you understand what implications Brexit could have there. But well worth the audience and business community bearing in mind, checking those other nations you may be doing business with that currently benefit from EU trade deals, to spot whether there could be changes down the line. Does that sound about right to you there, David?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. So thinking then about the UK Internal Market Bill, obviously it's been causing a lot of fuss in the press, and particularly in relation to that undermining international law around the protocols in Northern Ireland. Quite a lot's been happening lately. Would you mind giving us a bit of an idiot's guide to what the protocols on Northern Ireland are, what those core pieces are, and the implications of what's in the Internal Market Bill in relation to those?
Yeah, well, Northern Ireland, if you think back over the last 3 years, the whole time of the Brexit negotiations, Northern Ireland has been a real conundrum for the UK and the EU. The question being, how can Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, still benefit from access to the EU internal market, so that a hard border does not need to be erected on the island of Ireland again? I think everyone has been keen to avoid that for fear of plunging Northern Ireland back into its troubled past. So the solution that came up in this Northern Ireland protocol was to give Northern Ireland a fairly unique place halfway between the EU and the UK. So for most purposes, as regards trading goods, Northern Ireland is part of that EU single market. It has to comply with EU law regulations around goods and producing food and the like. As part of that, it means that goods can flow freely across that border between Northern Ireland and Republic. But it's also part of the UK, and under the terms of the deal in the protocol, UK goods can move into Northern Ireland as long as they are destined only to stay in Northern Ireland. But what the protocol provided was that if they were at risk of moving onwards down into the Republic of Ireland, or indeed elsewhere into the EU, then they would need to be subject to those border checks, controls and regulation, because essentially they were gaining access to the UK single market, and the EU couldn't just sort of tear down half of the wall around its EU internal market. So that system involves then a different regulatory landscape in Northern Ireland, continuing to follow EU law, whilst the rest of the UK is free to go its own ways, but with that safeguard to say that some UK goods could still go to Northern Ireland unless they were at risk of moving onwards. What has caused a particular bit of upset is how one defines whether goods are at risk. And what the EU ensured the protocol did was that by default, any good going into Northern Ireland was at risk of going into the EU, unless this new joint committee, which the UK and the EU sit on, could agree particular things or circumstances that were not at risk. And that was really a factor. I talked about those rushed negotiations last year. There was no time to bottom out all those details. This was an issue they agreed they would park and hand over to the joint committee, but with a default sitting there that everything is at risk unless something is agreed. So that's one of the things the UK government is complaining about, saying, well, that's incredibly unfair to say that everything is at risk and it doesn't reflect the reality. But it does reflect the deal, and it reflects the reality. Well, the EU and the UK have to come to an agreement in that joint committee, and they need to come together. I think there is every sign that the EU is acting in good faith and is prepared to reach an agreement. Both sides haven't been able to find that just yet. The other big factor is around state aid control, which is about subsidies that government or other public bodies might get, or regulatory favours that operate as a commercial competitive advantage for businesses. And as well as restricting what subsidies can be applied in Northern Ireland, the protocol actually reaches back into the rest of Great Britain and prevents state aid being granted to other parts of the industries in other parts of the UK if they are likely to affect competition in Northern Ireland. And that's typically in EU law a pretty low threshold. And so again, this is something that was clear when the protocol is signed up. It's understandable the UK government is unhappy with that outcome, but it is nonetheless an outcome that they signed up to it. So what we've seen now in this in the UK Internal Market Bill is the UK government looking to rewrite that bit of history and giving itself the powers to override what's in the Northern Ireland Protocol. So firstly, as regards giving itself back the power to be able to grant that state aid and stop the EU interfering with state aid applying in the rest of GB. And also sort of giving itself the power to sort of control what happens as regard those border checks and controls on goods moving between Britain and Northern Ireland.
So an example of making sure you know what you're signing up to, I suppose, and perhaps not trusting the details can be worked out later. Okay, so that's what they're putting in place. With that in mind, with the UK Internal Market Bill still working through, the Northern Ireland Protocols as the default, if you like, do you have any advice for businesses that do trade with Northern Ireland? They either might send goods to or fro, or they may have subsidiaries there. Is there any advice that you can give them?
Well, I think probably the good thing about trading in Northern Ireland is that it shouldn't be hugely different from trading there now. What's not clear at the moment is the extent to how some things will operate when the UK is starting to adopt its own regulatory regimes that will replace EU law, issues around labelling products or identifying where they come from for particular types of products. The UK hasn't yet set out its regime. What is clear at the very least is, I think businesses should continue just to carry on doing what they have doing in meeting those EU law requirements, because it is essentially the EU law requirements that will apply in Northern Ireland. I think businesses don't need to worry excessively about those high-level political disputes and arguments that are going on between the EU and the UK. To some extent, businesses are shielded from those. As businesses, all we need to worry about is operating on the basis of the law as it stands, and the UK is writing those laws about what checks. That's the law to comply with. The EU may say that is wrong. That's not an issue that it will take up with businesses. It's an issue that it will take up with the UK. I expect we will see a dispute settlement mechanism going on. There will probably be some arbitration between the UK and EU that will run over the next couple of years. I would say businesses don't need to worry about that. They just need to worry about what the laws are they're being told to apply now, because they are shielded. They will not suffer those effects, it's the UK government that will need to deal with those issues. And should it lose an arbitration in a few years' time, then it might need to, amend the laws to comply with it then at that point, and businesses would need to adapt then.
Fantastic. So nice, clear bit of advice there. Stick to the law, let the politicians sort it out between themselves, and we'll all be okay. I'm very conscious that we are out of time already. This conversation has gone very quickly from my side. Thank you so much, David, for sharing your expertise with us. I wonder if I could ask you to close the session by just answering a final question. If you could leave businesses listening with just one final piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, I think I would say since 1945, the political and economic consensus has been around the world to try and do what we can to lower trade barriers. This is the first time a major developed nation since 1945 has decided to go in the opposite direction. I think we're going to see something really very different. It probably is going to be a bumpy ride. It cannot be ignored. I think all we can do is make sure that we prepare for it. I think we will survive. I don't think it will be the end of our economy, but it will be a bumpy ride. And I think as long as we take some reasonable steps, then then businesses we can come through and out the other side of this.
Fantastic. We're all in a big experiment. Let's see where it goes. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much again, David. As I mentioned earlier, we're running a series of these webinars on a variety of different topics, some very specific as well to different parts of doing business. And of course, we have a range of international trade training courses available with free of charge places. So please do check those out. And as I say, if you have any questions at all, if you're a member of the Chamber, contact your relationship manager, or you can find a contact us on our website, www.greaterbirminghamchambers.com. Brilliant. Thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you at a future webinar soon.